Verse 5 of Daniel 11 is dividing the breakup of Alexander the Great's kingdom into 4 parts. And once the kingdom's divided into 4 parts, this is standard pioneer understanding of the history represented in verse 5. You have Ptolemy in the south, and you have a general of his, Antiochus. And Antiochus is aggressive, so he breaks away from Ptolemy. And in 301 BC, he conquers the east. In 286, he conquers the west. And in 281, he conquers the north. And from understanding Daniel 11, we've understood a very important principle, that being that... Seleucus. Who did I say? Okay, stand corrected. Thank you. Correct me on these names. I kick those around a lot. But we've understood that for pagan Rome or papal Rome or modern Rome to take their position as the king of the north, they have to conquer 3 geographical areas. For pagan Rome, it was Daniel 8:9, the east, the south, the pleasant land. For papal Rome, it was the Heruli, the Ostrogoths, and the Vandals. And for modern Rome, it's king of the south, the glorious land in Egypt. So in this verse, when we see Seleucus break away from Ptolemy and conquer these 3 entities, by the time 281 BC, when he conquers the king of the north, he has become the king of the north. And no longer are you going to see any kings of the west or the east in Daniel 11. Now it's simply a story about the king of the north and the king of the south. That's verse 5. Okay, verse 6 through 9. And so what we're saying is, this is much of the history that's taken place in fulfillment of Daniel 11 will be repeated, Sister White says. So we're saying that this history here that's in Daniel 11, verse 5, is typifying the plucking up of the 3 horns by papal Rome. Okay, and that ended. Therefore, 281 would typify 538. And the work of removing the 3 horns took 45 years. So it began in the first horn, 301, would correspond to 493. You don't need these dates to get my point. This threefold conquering by Seleucus is typifying the 3 horns being plucked up in order for the papacy to be the king of the north in 538. So verse 5 is giving a history that is illustrating the history of 493 to 538 as the papacy is coming into power. Verse 6 begins in 281. Okay, and it tells a story about the king of the south, Ptolemy, being threatened. Not that the king of the north is threatening him, he's just threatening him from the logic. His strong general left him. His strong general went and conquered these 3 entities. So he's down here now. His strong general controls 3/4 of the world. He's worried about his aggressive, strong general, ex-general. So he sends his daughter, Bernice, to strike a peace treaty in 252 BC. And the wife, his former wife, is going to execute Bernice and her son and the entourage. And in 246, Bernice's brother is going to come and retaliate, okay? So what we've understood is this is pioneer understanding of verses 6 through 9. You can read this in Thoughts on Daniel and Revelation by Uriah Smith. What we're saying is that this is typifying the history of 538 to 1798, and many of us may not know it, but in 1797 there was a peace treaty struck between France and Rome, the Treaty of Tolentino, that's typifying Bernice being given as a peace offering. And so we're saying verse 6 through 9, the history that has traditionally correctly been understood by the pioneers, is also representing the history of 538 to 1798. Okay? Verse 10, in the year 219 BC, is where the king of the north going to retaliate against Egypt, against the Ptolemaic kingdom, and it's going to go all the way up to the borders of Egypt. It's going to take all that territory that Egypt has controlled up to that point, except for Egypt. That's the part we missed. And that's typifying 1989, 1991. Okay, when the Soviet Union is swept away and we thought all of it was gone, but the head, Egypt, Russia was still standing as the king of the south. Okay, that's verse 10. And you can spend some quality time going through these histories. We're not doing that here. Okay, we're going to verse 11. Now the reason that I took some time in the last presentation to at least throw some concepts out there in the last couple of presentations about the role of the United States in Bible prophecy. France typifies the United States, and France is the first that commits fornication with the papacy, thus typifying that the United States is the first to commit fornication with the papacy. This took place in the Ronald Reagan years. And at least, not in the Latin world, but at least in our world in the United States, if a man and woman get married, traditionally the woman takes the man's name. But it's not that way in every culture, okay? But there's a coming together. So what I'm saying is there's a fornication that took place in the Ronald Reagan years with the papacy. And what the papacy supplies to that relationship is a corrupt church, a harlot. And what the United States supplies is the military and economic strength, but the civil part of it, the church-state relationship, is struck up there. So from this point on, we're going to be talking about the King of the North being the United States, but that's not denying the reality that the King of the North is the papacy. But the papacy's military extension, its military representative that's going to do battle on planet Earth, is the United States. And that's the case with the papacy of the past, too. The papacy's never had an army of its own. It always manipulated other armies to do its dirty work. So I just wanted you to see that that's the justification for identifying the United States as the King of the North, while at the same time holding to the idea that it is the papacy that is the King of the North. But they've come together back in the Ronald Reagan years. They have the same name now, all right? Okay, so verse 11. And the king of the south, which we assumed was swept away in 1989, so we could not make heads or tails of what verse 11 represented because of that. But now that we understand that the king of the south was the capital, the head of the Soviet Union, Russia, and that it was still standing, then we have to understand that the king of the south in this history is typifying the king of the south at the end of the world, which is none other than Vladimir Putin. Okay, and I haven't taken time to prove it, but I've already laid out a triple application of prophecy that the First World War and the Second World War typifying the Third World War, and it's all about bringing in the New World Order, the one world government, the United Nations. Okay, all three of those wars were for that purpose. And it's not an accident that Vladimir means ruler of the world and Donald means ruler of the world. You have these two players now, the King of the North, the King of the South, and both of their names are representing the struggle to take control of the world. All right? And when we used to teach Daniel 11, we would often use the book by Malachi Martin, a Jesuit with expertise on John Paul II and the Vatican, his book called The Keys of This Blood. And in that book, he correctly identifies that there was a three-way struggle going on for the control of the world between the Soviet Union, the United States, and the papacy. And he predicted that the papacy would ultimately win, and he predicted that the Soviet Union would be first swept away. Okay, and the book was written before 1989, and the book had some accuracies in it. But he, as we, did not recognize that Russia was a sleeper, so to speak, that the King of the South was still standing there, and it's still struggling to take control of the world. And I had a sister here arguing, not arguing, but arguing in the sense of presenting the thoughts that Turkey is the King of the North, and she pointed to the Turkey-Franco War in 1870 as evidence. And I said, well, the evidence I've seen is that the characteristics of the French Revolution are repeated in the characteristics of the Bolshevik Revolution. And I don't have that in front of me. But there are several characteristics that are associated with the French Revolution in 1793 that are just absolutely, One of the brothers that has the parallels, one of the brothers that's done the work on this was the guy that was doing the recording last week down in California. And he had some pictures, some photographs of like the palace at Versailles and the place where King Louis the 16th loses his head, and then the palace of the Tsar of Russia. What was their names? Well, anyway, it don't matter what their names were. It was a family. Pardon me? Might have been his first name, but they had a last name. It don't matter. But it's the same history. When the communists take control in France, they don't just execute the king, they execute his family. When they take control in the Bolshevik Revolution, they execute the Tsar and his family. The women have a part to play in both those histories, even the buildings where they took place. You look at them, they look like the same building. And there's several other little minor characteristics that are saying that the King of the South that arrives in history in 1793 and is represented in the country of France, it ends up migrating to Russia in the Bolshevik Revolution, and part of the evidence of that is that the Bolshevik Revolution possesses the same characteristics as the French Revolution. Okay, I haven't proven that to you, but I'm confident that if you search it out, you will find that. So, verse 11. And the king of the south, Russia, shall be moved with choler. And if you go into chapter 8, you can bring a secondary witness to what's going to go on here in the Battle of Raphia based upon the word choler, among other things. And shall come forth and fight with him, even the king of the north. So it's saying here Russia is going to come forth with choler and attack the United States. And he shall set forth a great multitude, and this here is the United States, is the king of the north. And the king of the north shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into the hand of the king of the south. The king of the north here, who are identified as the United States, is going to lose this battle. And in this history, as the pioneers understand it, the Battle of Raphia is this history of verse 11 and 12. No one in that history expected Egypt to prevail over the northern kingdom. It was the underdog by all accounts. But it did. It prevailed, and it caused the king of Ptolemy to lift his heart up, okay? Notice verse 12. And when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. Now, the casting down of the many 10,000s in this history is not what takes place in the war. The Battle of Raphia, he wins an unexpected victory against the king of the north. Russia is going to win unexpectedly against the United States, and then because of his victory, his heart is going to be lifted up, okay? And because of the unexpected victory in this history, the historians will tell you, and pioneers of Adventism will contribute to this history, that Ptolemy is invited to go to Jerusalem because everyone in the area, they're so amazed that Ptolemy has just defeated the king of the north that they think it's probably best to get on his good side of things. So the Jews invite Ptolemy to come to Jerusalem, and when he's there, he decides, his heart is being lifted up, he decides that he's going to go in the temple and do sacrifice. And the priests are trying to prevent him from doing this, and he's going to do it anyway. He's the ruler of the world. And the Lord strikes him down. Okay, doesn't kill him, but knocks him down. It's unclear. Some historians don't even mention that. Some do. It's unclear what his experience was, whether he was in a coma for a long time or just a short period of time. But the Lord strikes him down enough to know that he needs to get out of there, and he leaves there. And he goes back to Egypt, and he begins a persecution in Egypt where he kills a bunch of Hebrew Sabbath keepers. Okay, so this verse 12, when it says, when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he's taken away the multitude. That's when he has defeated the United States. Then his heart's lifted up. He's invited to go to Jerusalem. And then it says, and he shall cast down many 10,000s. The many 10,000s that he casts down are the Hebrews that are living in Alexandria primarily at that time period, Sabbath keepers. He first goes back and he creates a brand of Bacchus, which is a 3 or 4 leaf clover type. That's the symbol of the god Bacchus. And he creates a brand and he begins branding the Sabbath keepers on the forehead with his mark. Okay, if you get that. But that wasn't good enough. So he goes into Alexandria and he kills thousands of Sabbath keepers. So what this is saying, and this is Ptolemy, the king of the south. What this is saying is that one of the things that this is saying is that Russia is about to defeat the United States unexpectedly in a battle. And right after that, Russia is going to accomplish a persecution against Sabbath keepers in Russia that's going to be so severe that it's going to send shockwaves around the world. Okay, now, when we first began to introduce that idea, most of the people, and the people we're introducing it to, are sympathetic with this message. They're not those that are fighting this message, but most of us scratched our head and said, okay, are we really applying this right? But if you have been watching what's going on in Russia over the past 6 months, and especially over the past couple months, they're on the verge of doing this persecution already. When they outlawed the Jehovah's Witness, then there was a petition in Russia where like 12 million people signed it to protest it. And now the list of the people that are being banned in Russia, the list of religions, there's about 6 or 7 religions, and one of them is called the Seventh-day Adventist Church. If you're not aware of that, that's in probably the past 72 hours. Okay, so the idea that Russia could defeat the United States in an unexpected war, okay, that's kind of hard to swallow. But the idea that Russia would go back to Russia and create such a persecution against Sabbath keepers that it would cause shockwaves in Adventism all around the world, that's kind of hard to swallow too. But you're already seeing the evidence of it on both counts. I mean, how many times does Russia get to fly their bombers or their fighter jets over the coast of Alaska before we accidentally or purposely blow one of those planes out of the sky? You're aware that's been going on, right? Okay, it doesn't matter which way you look, whether you're looking at the concept, is there going to be a war between Russia and the United States, or is the possibility that Russia is going to accomplish some kind of persecution in Russia that's going to cause shockwaves around planet Earth? The historical evidence is already available to see if we're willing to see. Okay, so what's happening here, now stepping back with this to give you a second witness, what's happening here is Ptolemy, after this unexpected victory, his heart is lifted up. That's what the verse says. And what he wants to do is he wants to go into God's temple and do sacrifice. And he's not supposed to do sacrifice. Okay, so we have a second witness for a king of the south doing this very thing in 2 Chronicles 26. Second Chronicles 26. Let's begin in verse 15, just to add one other line that we don't usually put in. Verse 15, this is about King Uzziah. It says, and he made in Jerusalem engines invented by cunning men to be on the towers and upon the bulwarks, to shoot arrows and great stones withal, and his name spread far abroad, for he was marvelously helped till he was strong. He's become strong as a military king. And it says the Lord was helping this, and he's the king of the south. This is the king of Judah. So this is a king of the south. Ptolemy was a king of the south. Ptolemy has this unexpected military victory at Raphia. Uzziah has been building this military machine, and the Lord's helping him up to the point that he got strong, according to this verse. Once he got strong, pride set in. Because in verse 16 it says, but when he was strong, his heart was lifted up. That's what Ptolemy does in verse 12 of Daniel 11. His heart was lifted up to his destruction, for he transgressed against the Lord his God and went into the temple of the Lord to burn incense upon the altar of incense. So this king of the south is lifted up his heart against the Lord, just as Ptolemy does in verse 12. And he does the very same thing. He wants to go into God's temple and do the work of a priest. Verse 17, and Azariah the priest went in after him, and with 80 priests of the Lord that were valiant men. So how many priests are trying to chase Uzziah out of the temple? 81. How many are 80? And who's with them? The high priest Azariah. So there's 81. And 81 is a symbol of midnight. 81 is a symbol of midnight. The best example is go to the meetings in Holland and watch Parminder's presentation on the 1909 General Conference session, which was the last General Conference session that Sister White attended. And he'll go through and he'll give you the sermons that Sister White gave during that General Conference session, and they are going to be sermons, titles that contribute to the understanding we have of midnight. It was the last General Conference session that she ever attended, and she was 81 years old. And there are other biblical references that I don't know off the top of my head that mark 81 at midnight, which are available but are not with me. But here is another one. There's 81 priests that are resisting the work of the king of the south in doing the priest's work. And in verse 18 it says, and they withstood Uzziah the priest and said unto him, it appertaineth not unto thee, Uzziah, to burn incense unto the Lord, but to the priests, the sons of Aaron, that are consecrated to burn incense. Go out of the sanctuary, for thou hast trespassed, neither shall it be for thine honor from the Lord God. Then Uzziah was wroth, and had a censer in his hand to burn incense, and while he was wroth with the priest, the leprosy even rose up in his forehead before the priest in the house of the Lord from beside the incense altar. And Azariah the chief priest and all the priests looked upon him, and behold, he was leprous in his forehead. And they thrust him out from thence. Yea, himself hasted also to go out, because the Lord had smitten him. And of course, haste is a word associated with midnight. And Uzziah the king was a leper unto the day of his death, and dwelt in a several house, being a leper, for he was cut off from the house of the Lord. And Jotham his son was over the king's house, judging the people of the land. Now the rest of the acts of Uzziah, first and last, did Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos, write. This king of the south, his heart gets lifted up because of military strength, just like Ptolemy's heart gets lifted up because of military strength. They both want to go in and perform the priest's duties. The priests resist both. And with Ptolemy, he goes back into Egypt and puts the brand of Bacchus on Sabbath keepers, then kills thousands of Sabbath keepers. With Uzziah, he's struck with the mark of leprosy on his forehead. Leprosy is a symbol of sin. The mark of the beast is a symbol of sin. Both of these illustrations are an illustration of the abomination of desolation. Matthew 24:15. Jesus, let's go to Matthew 24:15. This is Jesus speaking. He says, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Now, Sister White identifies that this was fulfilled when pagan Rome placed the standards of Roman power in the sacred precincts of the temple that extended some furlongs outside the city. And when the Christians saw this sign fulfilled, they knew that they had to immediately flee Jerusalem. And she goes on to say, not one Christian died in the destruction of Jerusalem because they followed the sign of the abomination of desolation. But Sister White further references Matthew 24:15 in two other places and says, so as was the abomination of desolation a sign to the Jewish Christians to flee Jerusalem in the AD 70 time period. This is a paraphrase. She says, so too will the Sunday law be a sign to flee the larger cities to the smaller cities in advance of going to the mountains. My point is that Sister White is identifying that the abomination of desolation is a symbol of the Sunday law at the end of the world. Okay, so go to Psalms. This one sometimes beats me up. Give me just a second. Psalm 74. Yes, go to Psalm 74. I'm sure for myself that when Jesus is speaking about the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24:15, that he's basing this on Psalm 74. And in Adventism, normally we would say that to fulfill the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24:15, we know that pagan Rome fulfilled it, and Sister White identifies that papal Rome fulfills it with the Sunday law at the end of the world. So we would expect that the unholy power that comes into the sanctuary needs to be a king of the north. It can't just be a bad guy. It's got to be a northern king, because pagan Rome fulfilled it in AD 70, 66, 70 time period, and papal Rome fulfills it at the end of the world. Therefore, it has to be a northern king. That would be our typical understanding. But I'm wanting you to see that it can be any king, because I've just shown you that Ptolemy, in verse 12 of Daniel 11, desecrated the temple, and I'm claiming that this is a symbol of the abomination of desolation, which is in turn a symbol of the Sunday law, and that Uzziah, as the king of the south, did the very same thing. But these two guys are kings of the south, not kings of the north. So what I'm wanting you to see is that Jesus based his commentary about the abomination of desolation being a sign upon Psalms 74. So in Psalm 74, verse 1, it says, O God, why hast thou cast us off forever? Why doth thine anger smoke against the sheep of thy pasture? Remember thy congregation which thou hast purchased of old, the rod of thine inheritance which thou hast redeemed, this Mount Zion wherein thou hast dwelt. Lift up thy feet unto the perpetual desolations, even all that the enemy hath done wickedly in the sanctuary. Thine enemies roar in the midst of thy congregations. They set up their ensigns for signs. Okay, the abomination of desolation, as we understand it as Adventists, was fulfilled when the ensign of Rome was placed in the sacred precincts of the temple, which extended some furlongs outside the walls of the city. That ensign was a sign for the Jewish Christians to flee the church. And typically, we would expect that in order for that sign to be fulfilled, it has to be a king of the north. But I'm saying that Jesus is taking Psalm 74, verse 4 here, as his point of reference, and all it has to be is an enemy. Okay, thine enemies roar in the midst of thy congregations. They set up their ensigns for signs. Now, you may not get the significance of this, and I'm going to break out of verse 11 and 12 for a second. If you haven't been following closely this message, this will be tricky for you to accept at face value, because I'm not going to go into it in depth. We understand the Sunday law is the Sunday law in the United States. Daniel 11 verse 41, Revelation 13:11, Revelation 18:4. But we realize that at the midnight cry, the first Sunday law in the United States is introduced, because Sister White tells us that there will be a series of Sunday laws that leads to the Sunday law. So right here, the first Sunday law is introduced, and they're going to escalate till they reach the one where you're forced to observe Sunday and persecuted for keeping Sabbath. But it's a progressive. And this is clear in the Great Controversy. She teaches this. So here we have a Sunday law also. Okay, this is where the separation is taking place among the 11th hour workers, okay, at the Sunday law. Come out of Babylon, come stand with God's people. This is where the separation is taking place between the Levites of Adventism. You know, come stand with the faithful priests. So the point is, the characteristics of this waymark you will find typified in this waymark, but the separation of the priests, it takes place back here at midnight. Therefore, based upon two witnesses, it demands that there is a Sunday law typified at this history. Okay, do you follow my logic? Because God's dealing with men is ever the same. In the judgment, the priests are going to have their own peculiar judgment, but at one way it's going to be the same judgment that the Levites go through, even though they have some peculiarities of their own that are different than the 11th hour workers. His dealings with the 11th hour workers are still going to be the same as with the Levites and the priests. So at these waymarks that are marking the close of probation for these three groups, you're going to see the similar characteristics at all of them. And therefore there needs to be a Sunday law at least typified here. And what I'm saying is the Battle of Raphia is midnight. And in this story, in Daniel 11, verses 11 and 12, you have Ptolemy fulfilling the abomination of desolation when he goes into the temple in Jerusalem and attempts to offer sacrifices, offer offerings in there. And that is an enemy in thy sanctuary, setting up his ensign, his authority as a sign. So here, we're having a Sunday law typified at the Battle of Raphia. And what typifies this Sunday law is the persecution that somehow is going to take place in Russia after Russia unexpectedly defeats the United States in this Battle of Raphia. Okay, now you may, if you're like me, when you first hear when I first heard it, I presented it, the overall understanding that came out of Africa on these verses, and that's where this is coming from. And as I presented it, I says, I'm still a little bit, I didn't say skeptical, but that's probably a good word to describe it. there was things here I was uncertain about this idea that something that could happen in Russia could have such an impact on Adventism all around the world. But then I remembered that the history of World War I and World War II, and I'm understanding that this is the illustration of World War III. And all you have to do to see how Adventists are going to react when this war begins is go back to World War I and World War II. And what did the Adventist Church do in World War I and World War II? It got right close to the civil governments. So whatever you want to do with our church members, you go ahead and do it. These guys over here that are saying, I'm a conscientious objector, I don't want to bear arms, I don't want to be in the army on Sabbath, you do whatever you want with them. We'll disfellowship them from our church if that's what you need to do it. So the Adventist Church in World War I and World War II has already demonstrated what it does under a crisis in a world war. It responds on the wrong side of the issue. So to think that a world war could begin at the Battle of Raphia and that a persecution could take place in Russia that would so motivate the Adventist Church, its general conference is located in the United States, that it might reach out in some kind of agreement with the government of the United States is not that far-fetched, especially when you realize that Christ is our example in all things, and Christ was arrested at midnight. And when he was arrested at midnight, it was the Jews, which would be typifying the Seventh-day Adventist Church at the end of the world, that had reached out to pagan Rome in the time of Christ, which would be typifying the government of the United States in our day and age, and saying there is some troublers in our midst. They are seditious, blasphemers that we need to deal with. And they came and arrested and bound Christ at midnight, typifying that at midnight there's something going to happen, some kind of relationship that's going to be formed between the Seventh-day Adventist Church and the government of the United States that motivates the government of the United States to come and arrest the faithful priests at midnight. And I've left out the role of Judas in there because I'm just trying to make the point that whatever happens in Russia, it's understandable how the Seventh-day Adventist Church is going to cooperate. And if you're not familiar with it, brothers and sisters, that's been a typical trend for the General Conference throughout history when the faithful have protested issues. The leadership of the Seventh-day Adventist Church has taken the wrong position. I don't have sympathy with the Seventh-day Adventist Reform movement. Some of their doctrines are wrong, and some of their understandings of their history are wrong, and their end-time Bible prophecy is definitely wrong. But the reason that those people broke away from the Seventh-day Adventist Church is because the General Conference took the wrong position. Okay, they should have supported them in their refusal to not go to war in World War I, and they didn't. So we got the history to even back up this concept if we want to. Were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to ask, how does that fit in with the United States leading out in the Sunday law crisis? If Russia leads out in the Sunday law crisis,
I'm not saying.
Repeat the question.
How does that agree with the idea that the United States leads out in the Sunday law crisis is the question. I'm not saying that this is a Sunday law. I'm saying that after the Battle of Raphia in verse 11 and verse 12, when Ptolemy goes and wants to offer sacrifice in Jerusalem and then does a persecution, that it's typifying in agreement with the second witness of the king of the south, Uzziah, that when a king's heart's lifted up and he wants to do this activity as a priest when he's not a priest, that after Russia defeats the United States, that they're going to go accomplish a religious persecution in Russia that is typifying the abomination of desolation in the sense that it is giving those that will see it the sign. The priests need to see that this is a sign that the Sunday law is being typified here. I'm not saying that this is a Sunday law. I'm saying that this is a fulfillment of abomination of desolation, and that you and I are going to be held accountable to this light. We have to know what this means. Okay, but here, at the next waymark, there will be the first Sunday law in the United States, then the Sunday law in the United States, and then every country on the globe follows their example. It is the conclusion of a visual test. Yes. Okay, it's the conclusion of a visual test. Because here, the door is going to close. Okay? When they arrested Jesus, what did they do to him? They bound him. Okay, so when he's arrested at midnight, he's went into the binding off period. Are you wanting to say something?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I don't know if I can articulate it.
Maybe I'll help you.
You know, I hope you do, because maybe somehow this is the connection as far as when the Adventists go to the government and say things about God's people, Adventists, other Adventists, and maybe it's during that time period of the war when it's going on that make them go to the government. Do you know where I'm going?
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying, except I'm not going to say it the way you're saying. I'm saying this battle is over when his heart is lifted up. The Battle of Raphia takes place, his heart is lifted up. He begins a religious persecution in Russia.
So when we've had other studies about this, we've come to the conclusion that it's going to backfire on the Seventh-day Adventists.
Yes, okay, that's outside the scope of this study. I know where you're going with that.
But can you see that there might be a connection there?
More persecution.
But just between you and me then, maybe. I mean, you can't
I
explain
admit that
it.
I'm probably the only one that can see that connection, but I don't want to go out there right now. Okay. This is the conclusion of a visual test. You can show it at midnight. This is outside the scope of our study. This is where the caliphate, the end of the world caliphate of Islam, is set up right here at midnight as well. Okay, so you got to see that. You got to know what it means. I mean, ISIS has declared a caliphate, but there's one that's going to be more complete, more thorough, where all Islam is going to come together. And one of the things, this is a really minor thing, but it means so much to me, and I could be wrong on this. I could be wrong on the emphasis of this. I'm right on what I'm going to say, but maybe I see it with too much emotion and unbalance. But one of the most important symbols of Islam in the natural world is locusts. And when locusts begin to come to life, they begin to come alive here. There's some locusts, there's some locusts, and here's some locusts, and before long there's some more locusts, and they're annoying, and so on and so forth. But there reaches a point with locusts where it seems like almost overnight they are suddenly an overwhelming scourge. They reach a point now, they're at the boiling stage, and you're not going to stop them. They're going to swallow up everything in their path, okay? That is one of the primary symbols of Islam. And what I'm saying is, here in this history that we're in right now, we can see the locust flying around causing their grief. But locusts in the natural world, they reach a point to where they come together in a swarm, and then you've got a headache like you've never seen before. Here, Islam does not strike here. Islam does not strike at midnight. Islam strikes the United States at the midnight cry. Islam strikes the United States at the Sunday law. And Islam strikes the United States over here at 9/11. But it only strikes 3 times. Because Balaam is the story of Islam. And Balaam was the false prophet, the United States, that has 3 experiences with that ass. And an ass represents Islam, where he's going to strike that ass. The first one's 9/11. The second one is the midnight cry, where the United States is crippled in between 2 walls, this wall and this wall, by Islam. And then the third is here. I'm only saying that Islam's still a player here, but what Islam does here is it forms the caliphate. You need to see that. This is visual. You need to see what goes on in Russia. This is going to be the motivation of the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, coming into some kind of civil agreement to protect themselves from what they think's coming, because they think after the Battle of Rafia that the lone superpower in the world is Russia. The Seventh-day Adventist Church hasn't been studying Daniel 11. They don't realize that in Daniel 11 it says from midnight to the midnight cry that Trump is going to rebuild his financial structure and rebuild his military, and over here he's going to retaliate against Russia and wipe them off the face of the earth. Okay, so they're going to be afraid of what they saw in Russia. They're going to implement some kind of legal arrangement with the government of the United States. And one of the things Sister Kathy was bringing out is that there's a rule that with what judgment you measure, it shall be measured unto you. Okay, here the Seventh-day Adventist Church is going to strike a deal with the government of the United States to persecute the faithful priests. But at this waymark, they're going to realize that the first Sunday law has been implemented, and now the judgment that they've placed against the priest here is going to be brought upon here. And this is the reason that the Levites decide they're going to come and stand with the priests, because they're going to finally wake up to the fact that the Seventh-day Adventist Church has just agreed to the first Sunday law and something's wrong. But the Seventh-day Adventist Church here is already going to have struck the legal agreement back here that leads them to accept this first Sunday law hands down. And from here on out, it's downhill for both the Seventh-day Adventist Church and the United States. But I'm getting outside the scope of this.
I just love to say the Seventh-day Adventist Church legal organization.
Yeah, the corporate structure. My sister here in between, and now she's wanting me to make sure I make the distinction for all of you, that when I'm saying the Seventh-day Adventist Church, I'm not talking about every church member in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Or when I'm saying that probation closes for the United States, I'm not talking about every citizens of the United States. I'm talking about the United States as a nation at the Sunday law will have filled up the cup of its iniquity, and its probationary time closes right where the probationary time of the Seventh-day Adventist Church closes as well. But this is a conclusion of a visual test. Okay? Because from 9/11 to here, you're having the work of the everlasting gospel accomplished. And the work of the everlasting gospel is a 3-step testing prophetic message. These are the 3 steps. Each of these are a test. In early writings, 259 to 261, Sister White describes a 3-test testing process in the time of Christ. She says, those that would not receive the teachings of John the Baptist could not be benefited by the teachings of Jesus. And those that rejected the teachings of Jesus were led further to crucify him, which prevented them from seeing the way into the heavenly sanctuary. Something along that line. That's the second paragraph. The third paragraph goes to Millerite history, and she says, those that rejected the first angel's message could not be benefited by the second angel's message, neither could they be benefited by the midnight cry, which was to teach them the way into the most holy place. So here, when the angel comes down on 9/11, the everlasting gospel is being accomplished in our history, and these 3 tests are the same in terms of tests, but they're different. This test is a litmus test. The third test is where you and I are going to demonstrate the character that we've prepared in this history. Okay, but a second test, I'm hoping you've all studied these tests, is always a visual test, right? Here the door closes. The door closes on the ark, right here. The visual test is the animals getting on the ark. Okay, so we have a visual test, and it culminates here with the formation of the caliphate, with the persecution that goes on in Russia immediately after the Battle of Raphia. And we typically identify that in here we have an image of the beast test, and we do, and we have a world image of the beast test. So in here, there's going to be an image of the beast test as church and state, the government of the United States and the Seventh-day Adventist Church, combination of church and state, are coming together in this history. But for us, for you and I, it's already began. It's already began, the visual test. Because in our history, in order for the image of the beast to be set up in the United States, the Protestants of the United States have to take control of the civil government of the United States. And the first step in them doing that is in conquering the 3-fold obstacle that's in their way. And the 3-fold obstacle that is in the way of the Protestants in the United States is the Congress, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And as of 11/8/2016, those 3 obstacles were conquered, and this image of the beast test is underway for Seventh-day Adventists that will see it. The animals are getting on the ark, but for the priests, that's going to conclude right here with this caliphate and this persecution in Russia. But we still have verse 13. Time check, my brother Bill? Okay, verse 13 of Daniel 11. Now, my brother Dave earlier, yesterday maybe, he was talking about, maybe he wasn't talking in public, maybe just talking to me. But he brought out about when Rome comes into this history. And Rome comes into this history in verse 14. Okay, so there's more than one thing that's happening in verses 13 to 15. So I'm just saying that out front.
Can I ask you something about what we were just talking about, or is it too late?
No, it's not too late.
Okay.
She wants to ask something about what we were just talking about. Go ahead.
Okay. So with the backlash then that comes, so Islam, maybe being used, so the third woe may be being used to bring desolations to those Sabbath keepers who aren't really keeping the law and keeping the Sabbath, those Seventh-day Adventists that are going down. So actually, that backlash I'm just asking, could that be part of where the third woe might fit in to actually be protecting the true keepers and also being a backlash on those who really aren't true Seventh-day Adventists who are claiming the name?
Okay, the question is, as I'm going to restate your question, we have understood that Islam accomplishes two things. It's used as a judgment against the apostate church, is the way the pioneers understood what Islam was to do. They were raised up to judge the papacy, but at the same time they provided an umbrella of protection for God's people. So she's asking, with the third woe arriving in history at 9/11, can it be that at one level they are providing an umbrella of protection for the faithful Seventh-day Adventists in this history, but at the same time be part of the judgment that is being carried out against the unfaithful Seventh-day Adventists? Is that a fair reflection?
That's what I'm asking. I'm also wondering if the shepherd's rod who think they're fulfilling Ezekiel 9 and going and slaying the saints that are unfaithful are going to play a part with them.
So
And
are
there's
the
gonna be
shepherd's
total
rod part of
mayhem
that
in the
role?
total mayhem in the fallen churches. I'm just wondering.
Okay, and so she's just wondering these ideas, and
I'm asking your opinion.
my opinion, okay. My opinion is that Islam is going to provide an umbrella of protection for the faithful among God's people, because that has been the role that they've played in the past. And I expect that Islam will be used as a tool of judgment against unfaithful Adventists, but it will not be the only tool. Just standard military warfare, laws of the land. So even shepherd's rod, the zealous, misguided shepherd's rod may do that work too. If you don't know their history, they're thinking that they're going to be raised up at the Sunday Law Crisis to go into the Adventist church and execute the unfaithful Adventists. So all those factors, how the wicked die, I think could come in any variety.
So if we think we're going to be safe by hugging and snuggling up with, the government and so forth, really, it's not going to work that way.
So if we think we're going to be safe by drawing close to the government, really it's not going to work that way. Amen. We have no government. We are pilgrims and strangers. That's not simply a nice song. It's a reality we have to settle into. Daniel was not a Babylonian. He was in captivity in a land he didn't want to be in, and he's typifying our experience. We are captive in a world that is manifesting the fruits of 6,000 years of sin, and we have to treat ourselves as Daniel treated himself in Babylon, by taking a position we would rather eat the heavenly food and die rather than eat the king's meat and die for eternity. Okay, so verse 13. Yep. And now, when we first started teaching this, me primarily probably put a poor concept in. I was teaching that verse 13 to verse 15 is the Battle of Peniam, okay? It's not. The Battle of Peniam is going to come in verse 15. But this is the history that surrounds the Battle of Peniam. Verse 13 says, "For the king of the north shall return." The United States is going to return. The United States isn't going to be totally wiped out by Russia at the Battle of Raphia. He's going to return and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former. Okay, so Trump, in this history right here, there's going to be a military escalation. And you know what happens in a country typically if they're building up their military? Economic boom. Okay, so that's typically what happens. Set forth the multitude greater than former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with much riches. There is the characteristics of the United States, armies and riches. Okay, that's the chariot, ships, and horsemen of verse 40. So he's saying he's going to return after certain years, rebuilt after the Battle of Raphia. And time is no longer, so I don't know what to read into the years other than it's identifying that there's a period of time between the Battle of Raphia and the Battle of Peniam. And I'm only doing this at the surface level, okay, because as an example, things I'm leaving out so you can get my point. At the Battle of Raphia, the very day of the Battle of Raphia, there was a peace treaty. Okay, because that was standard operating procedure in those times. When they had wars in those times, they fought all day long, and at the end of the day, they would have a peace treaty, and both sides would go out and pick up their dead and wounded. That was standard. So at the Battle of Raphia, in that history, there's a peace treaty right there at the first day, but then the king of the north withdraws to a city that very day. And at that city, he determines he wants to make a peace treaty. So there's another peace treaty instituted here. And then there's one other peace treaty you can see in that history. Okay, so when you get into the details of this, there's more information about this history. And the reason that I'm throwing this in is to teach you that I'm just giving you a surface level of these verses. But also the peace treaty here, this is part of the story. Okay, because in this history, Trump and Putin, in theory, are going to sit down and they're going to pretend like they're working out some kind of peace treaty, but it's only to buy time, because they're both going to be building their military and economic might for the upcoming battle here. And in verse 13, that's what's being said about Trump primarily. And verse 14 says, and in those times, the previous verse says after certain years. So in the history between the battle of Raphia and the coming battle of Pippenger, in those times, there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Who's the king of the south? Russia. So in this history, not only between Raphia and the next battle, Pippenger, not only is Trump going to be building up his military industry, military complex, his military might, but he's going to be doing the art of the deal, and he's going to be going out to the other nations of the world and saying, you need to come into an alliance with me in order to deal with Russia. And this gives you the logic, if you'll see it, about why Trump, when you get to here, begins to fulfill the role of the primary king of the 10 kings. He's bringing them, he's consolidating them together in this history for the Battle of Pippenger, because he's about to transition from the President of the United States to Ahab, the king of the 10 kings over here. Okay, but this many standing up against Russia is taking place in this history, and I'm arguing that the reason that they're standing up is because the United States is going and putting pressure on them, saying you need to get on our side of the issue. And also there's another power that's doing the same thing. Back to verse 14. And in those times there shall many stand up against Russia, the king of the south. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. Now the robbers of the vision is pagan Rome. The robbers of thy people that establish the vision is pagan Rome. And this was such a controversy in Millerite history that the only thing that you're going to see on this sacred chart that isn't identified in prophecy is right here. Okay? You're not going to have a biblical reference for this. But this sacred chart, according to Sister Wright, was directed by the hand of the Lord, and it should not be altered. The figures were as he wanted them. So up here at 164, it says, death of Antiochus Epiphanes, who of course stood not up against the Prince of Princes, as he had been 164 years dead before the Prince of Princes was born. This controversy in the history of the Millerites is one of these final Grecian kings, Antiochus Epiphanes, is he the one that's typified by the robbers of thy people or other symbols of Rome? Or is Rome symbolized by the robbers of thy people? So this Antiochus Epiphanes, he's a Syrian king. He's a Greek king. He's the last of the Greek line of kings. Okay, so he's a king of the north. Okay, so if go back into verse 14, it says, and in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south. Also the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision. When William Miller addressed this distinction about whether the robbers of thy people are representing Antiochus Epiphanes, the last of these Greek kings, or did it represent Rome, he's identifying that these Greek kings, they're the king of the north. They're already standing up against the king of the south. They're already in war with them. So when the verse says also, that's the focus of William Miller, is the word also. In fact, I think when he writes out his article, as they used to do in that time period to put emphasis on this word, he capitalized every letter. Also, the robbers of thy people. This can't be one of the last Greek kings. It has to be a new power that's being introduced. That's what William Miller argued and the Millerites argued. But they dealt with this controversy with the Protestant theologians, the whole Millerite history. It was such a controversy that it ends up represented on the chart with the number 164. So here in verse 14, you also have the robbers of thy people standing up, which is the introduction of pagan Rome into this prophecy. And this took place in 200 BC. And Uriah Smith will tell you this in Thoughts on Daniel and Revelation. But you know what else Uriah Smith will tell you? He'll tell you that a power is never introduced in prophecy until they come into contact with God's people. And shortly thereafter, Uriah Smith's going to say the first time Rome comes into contact with God's people is 161 BC. So he's kind of contradicting himself. He's saying Rome comes into the prophetic narrative in 200 BC. He says a power never gets introduced in prophecy until they come in contact with God's people. They don't come in contact with God's people in 200 BC. He says so. He says they don't come in contact with God's people until 161 BC. So there's a contradiction in the writings of Uriah Smith on this subject that I'm not saying is a contradiction. I'm only saying it is a contradiction to make sure you see that it is being emphasized by the Lord. There's something that we need to understand. Why is Uriah Smith saying two things? The same contradiction ends up on this chart as the only reference on the chart that isn't direct from the Bible. So the robbers of thy people, they're very important, and they're very important just from the verse because it says whoever the robbers of the people are, if they're Antiochus Epiphanes or if they're Rome, what do? They establish the vision. Okay, this is big stuff. The vision is the vision of prophetic history, and it's established by Rome. Rome establishes the vision, not Antiochus Epiphanes. So in this history right here, this is where pagan Rome comes into history. What would that be typifying in our history? This is the arrival of modern Rome. Modern papacy is forced to come into this history. Doesn't want to, it's forced to come in this history. We'll deal with that maybe later. But verse 15. And after we get through verse 15, we can take a break. Verse 15 says, so the king of the north, who's the king of the north? United States shall come and cast up a mountain, take the most fenced cities, and the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. This is the Battle of Panium. And this is where the United States defeats Russia. And this is the end of Russia. Okay, so this here, this is where the light of this passage opens up.
So the United States under the power of Rome. Just for
In alliance, I would say. Okay, because they're going to, Rome prevails over the United States here. This is where Rome conquers. This is where Rome wants to conquer the United States, but she's forced to come out into history here.
What was the question?
The question was, so here is where Rome, how do you say it, prevails?
just because the papacy is the king of the north.
Yep.
So just tying it for those who maybe aren't following, and it was stated that the U.S., the king of the north U.S., putting two and two together for them, the papacy equals the United States, in that case, the alliance.
Okay. She's identifying that Rome comes in, the modern Rome, the papacy comes into history here. That is the king of the north. The United States is also the king of the north in the sense that it's its military apparatus. It comes in here. That's a correct observation. My point in taking the time to describe the controversy, the contradiction, the anomaly of 164 up there, is to say that verse 14 is purposely being emphasized, that this is where Rome comes into the history. Not so much to make a distinction between the United States being the king of the north or Rome being the king of the north, but to emphasize that the papacy did not want to come here. The papacy wanted to arrive on the scene here. But she is forced to come in here because the power that was going to place her on the throne of the earth was just defeated. And she has to come to prop up and hold the United States up in order that the United States can finish the work that it's going to do about placing her up on the throne of the earth. And the reason that you can say that she's forced is because of the 5 times that Rome as a king or a power is mentioned in Daniel 11 is verse 14. And then you have Pompey, you have Julius Caesar, you have Augustus Caesar, and Tiberius Caesar. Tiberius Caesar has no indication that he got in any warfare. But in 200 BC, this history was fulfilled when there was a rebellion in Egypt and Rome was forced to go down and protect the young child king in Egypt. Okay, it's forced to come out into history. Pompey is forced to intercede between a civil war that's going on in Jerusalem. So he's forced to go into Jerusalem and settle that matter. Julius Caesar was forced to come into history and deal with the rebellion of Pompey. And Augustus Caesar was forced to come into history and deal with the rebellion of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. So in Daniel 11, the 5 times that Rome is mentioned, one time Rome doesn't come into battle at all, but the other 4 times she's always historically forced, not because she wants to, she's forced to come into history. So here the papacy is being forced out of hiding. Okay, she's going to be forgotten on Isaiah 23 until the Sunday law, but here she's being forced into this history earlier than we think. And the reason for it, to me, is because we don't realize the sea change that takes place when the world wakes up after the Battle of Raphia and realizes they were wrong. They thought the United States was the lone superpower, but Russia just defeated the United States, which means the lone superpower is Russia. And Russia just returned to the homeland and began to put to death Sabbath-keeping Christians. Everything's turned upside down. The United States has just been humiliated and defeated. And the United States, the papacy knows that the United States is the power that's going to place it at the throne of the earth. It has to come and prop up the United States in order to capture the throne. Okay?
So when the papacy comes out in the open and the Adventist Church sees that and still does what they do with the government, that's their image. That's their...
Well, the Adventist Church is going to begin its dirty work here. Rome's coming out in here.
Well, okay.
Okay. And there's more to this in Daniel 11. When you get into verses 24 through 29, you're going to see Julius or Augustus Caesar and Mark Antony, Julius Caesar, the Caesars sitting down at a table and telling lies to one another. Okay, that's his peace treaty process. But Rome's going to end up at this peace treaty process, no doubt, as well. And they're going to be saying peace, safety, but then comes sudden destruction here. Because Russia gets taken out here, but what happens here as well? Who takes out Russia according to this application? The United States. Trump's going to take Russia out. But what happens here to the United States? Pardon me? The United Nations coming in, but what happens to the United States at that point in time? They get struck by Islam and it cripples them. Okay, the United States isn't out of the woods. This is the second strike of Islam. This is where the ass crashes Balaam's foot into the wall and cripples him. Here, the United States is crippled. Okay, here the ass is going to speak. The speaking in prophecy is the Sunday law. Shall we pray?